might remember from our last time that we dealt with the subject of the skeptics and the atheists that we're dealing with these supposed called four horsemen there and their anti-God books, which are out there in the world and have been out there for about 20 years now, where they have tried to pull down religion and particularly the Old Testament and to show people that there is no such God. And recently, Richard Dawkins put out another book which was aimed at young people called Outgrowing God. And we get a very distinct idea that there has been and is a very successful campaign to get the world to move away from religion and from God, and particularly away from the Old Testament. So we're dealing with people like Richard Dawkins. We saw last time that what he does is gives men the excuse to be what they really want to be. He himself is a little bit unsure about God totally, so he says there's probably no God, but they don't want to know about God, and so they find many reasons to speak against him. And we're up against the challenge of the new atheists, and we've dealt with in our previous class the jealousy of God, slavery and racism and genocide and all of those things that they charge God with. Today we're going to deal with that last one on the list there, which is about how God supposedly demeans and suppresses women. Of course, in this particular thing that they project, they team up with the feminist movement and they target religion expressly. And this is one of a noted feminist that you can find on the internet. But she makes the point very clearly: religion is against women's rights and women's freedom. In all societies, women are oppressed by all religions. That's a pretty general statement. But, you know, they have this very firm opinion that the law of Moses especially was a problem, as is, of course, many other religions, particularly Islam. And she goes on to say this: I strongly believe that no one can be a true feminist without being an atheist. All religions are anti-women. No one can be a pro-woman while supporting anti-women dogmas. And to people like this, their God has become absolutely loyalty to the feminist cause. So if it doesn't agree with feminism, then you can't even have the concept of a God behind it. So they start from the premise that feminism is actually the perfect way to think. Instead of course, as we do, starting from the premise that there is a creator God who has the right to tell us how he will have the universe to be managed and how we should also conform to his patterns of doing things. And this is a classic case of people trying to recreate God in their own image. To them, their God has become their feminist ideals. And they are very clear. This is a fairly ancient feminist, but one of the early people who took on the church. And she said this: I have endeavored to dissipate all these religious superstitions from the minds of women and to base their faith on science and reason. Of course, you can see she was an early humanist. I found for myself at last that peace and comfort I could never find in the Bible and the church. The less they believe, the better they are for their own happiness and development. The Bible and the church have been the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation. And you can probably understand some of this sentiment because in many ways the church, the established Church of England and the Catholic Church have been quite repressive of women in some areas. And they certainly, the culture of society treated women quite poorly. So we have to ask the questions: can we defend all religion? I remember a few years ago, Tony Blair actually debated on the BBC against Richard Dawkins about could religion be defended. Well, you know, he was pretty well cleaned up because there are so many things you can point at religion that have been so wrong. There have been so many wars based on religion, and you've only got to look at the Sunnis and the Shias in the Middle East today to see how that can work itself out. You have religions that have honor killings of people who don't conform. You have the Taliban and what they're doing in Afghanistan now, the bombing of girls' schools in Pakistan. And all of these things are done in the name of religion. And you've only got to go to Northern Ireland to see how vicious it can get. And you know, we can't defend any of those things because all of those practices are completely against the word of God. So we note that Jesus confronted the hypocritical religion of the Jews at his time. He also warned us that in the age to come, there would be false prophets who would rise up and speak perverse things. So, you know, religion in total cannot be defended because much evil has been done in the name of religion. And even today, some of the major religions of the world, they demean women to a very low status. They mutilate women and they suppress them far beyond what is required by God. It doesn't mean then that true religion has to be thrown out along with all the others. In fact, Christadelphia has a remarkable history of being far ahead of society when it came to implementing Bible principles. You're probably aware that in Christadelphia in the 1870s, sisters were given the vote in ecclesial life, 40 or 50 years before they got the vote in society. Women went out and actively preached the gospel like Sister Roberts used to do. Women were consulted on ecclesial matters. They were encouraged to study the Bible for themselves. Whereas in most of the established church, that was all left to the priest or the minister, and even maybe some men, but very few women were ever encouraged to study the Bible for themselves. And of course, when it comes to marriage, the Christadelphian movement have had a much clearer idea of the ideal relationships within marriage. And so women have had a much less patriarchal view of marriage in our Christadelphian community. And the reason we have been ahead of society on some things in those years was we actually did it from the Bible's guide standpoint rather than worrying about what society dictated to us. So true religion does offer better morals, better values and protection for women than most religions down through history, and especially in some areas of the world today. So here are the objections that the feminists have about the law of Moses. We'll deal with some of these today and some of them next class, God willing. Sarah calling Abraham Lord and Master, of course, that's absolutely choking material for most feminists. Only males could be priests, and of course, when you go to the New Testament, Jesus chose 12 male disciples. So again, they have a real problem with the way that the priests and the disciples were chosen. Girls belonging to the father's house, the terminology of the Old Testament always attributed girls as belonging to their father's house. Baby girls incurring a double uncleanness of 80 days for the mother. And again, that's a classic case where they just don't go and look at what it's trying to teach rather than what happened. Girls could be sold off to pay off family debts, and we will deal with that one in Exodus 21 today. And males could override female vows, which we'll cover in our next class. And a number of other areas where they point out the law of Moses, they believe was demeaning to women. What they don't tend to do is to look at the ancient world and the laws extant at the time that the law of Moses was given, to see how vastly different the law of Moses was to all the codes of the ancient world when it came to the way that women were treated and regarded and honoured. And we're going to look at many of those positive examples, how women were so differently treated to the ancient world in which they lived, and how different that is to particularly modern Islam in so many countries today. You might be aware that women in Saudi Arabia have just been given permission to drive a car, but they have to be escorted everywhere they go outside the house. And that just shows you, even in a modern country today, that we still have an unbiblical repression of women coming from their particular religion. So, as with all things, we need to just go back and look at the foundations of the world that God set down. In Genesis 1-3, God gave us the basic principles of society that he wanted to see. So both male and female were made in the image of God and the angels. And we're told that in the image of God made he them, male and female made he them. So, both of male and female are images of the divine. When it came to the nation of Israel being made a kingdom of priests, male and female were present, and they were all part of the holy nation that God set up at the Mount Sinai. Godly women were active and were held in respect and honour outside the home. And you read Proverbs 31, and it's so different to the way women are treated in many countries today. Think of the poor women in Afghanistan who are now going back inside their burqas, inside their house, away from education. And you can just see how different that is to Proverbs 31, where the woman is actively out involved in commerce, as well as being a strength inside the home, and how she was respected for her work that she did. And you can just see how different that is to what we see in some religions today. What we do find in the law of Moses is that there were many laws that were given to protect vulnerable women and to make sure they were not abused. And we're going to see a number of those today. And this is something that you don't see in many of the Islamic religions in particular, is that women are treated as well down the list. You know, it's usually the fathers and then the sons, and then the women are somewhere down the end of the road. And vulnerable women don't have any protection in those societies. And now we have a situation where in the law of Moses, there was a tremendous emphasis upon protecting the women who were left in vulnerable situations. And we'll look at some of those as we go through. So let's come to the first one. Why were there no women priests? Well, when you look at the fact that God chose the family of Aaron to be his priests, the skeptics and the feminists, they always put the worst construction on the Bible. They judge God's law in comparison to their modern day values, which of course those values do tend to change over time. So they say if there were no female priests, then God is discriminatory, he's a misogynist, and therefore he can't be accepted because he doesn't conform to our values. Well, as we know, you cannot approach the Bible and God and eternity in those terms, because God is the creator, God made the world, God set the laws of this world, and God has set the morals and values of this world. And what we have in the Bible comes from a wise and loving father who knows best for his children. So what God did was he appointed one family to be priests. And this is God's prerogative. This is God's right to say, well, I'm creating this nation, I'm creating this priesthood, I will determine who are going to be my priests. And in doing so, he not only discriminated against women, God discriminated against 11 other tribes and the rest of the tribe of Levi who were not of Aaron's family. So, you know, God bypassed almost all of the world's population to choose just one family to be his priests. And God's not bound by modern concepts of equal rights and equal opportunity. He said, I'm going to choose one family to be my priests. So this, of course, is a problem for the feminists. But God established right from the beginning a hierarchical order. You know, God didn't say, well, the women of the house of Aaron could be priests. No, he said, there is a hierarchical order which I have set in place right from the beginning. I first made Adam. I first made the man. I put him in charge of the garden. I gave him my law. And when the law was broken, he was the one that I held most accountable, because he was the one that should have made sure that law was upheld in the garden. Eve led the transgression. So historically, women were in the transgression first. And God has since restated his divine order that based on what happened as a matter of history in the Garden of Eden, God says, I want my roles to be respected and enforced. And when we come to the New Testament, that comes down to the symbol of the head covering. So God says, these are my principles. This is what happened in history. I have now reinforced my values. So when it came to appointing the family of Aaron to be the priests, God discriminated in modern terms against all the rest of humanity and against the women in the house of Aaron, because God had roles set down for men and women that differ. But when it comes to salvation, when it comes to worship, when it came to offering for the tabernacle, when it came to the sacrifices, when it came to be Nazarites, God gave women equal access to the sacrificial code. And it's the same with us, of course, in the gospel of Christ. We have salvation, and we're all the seed of Abraham by faith, both male and female, but all one in Christ Jesus when it comes to our relationship to God in the future and the promises. But when it comes to the roles in this life, God makes the choices. God has that prerogative to make sure that his ways are upheld and honoured. Now, one of the great differences between the law of Moses and all the ancient codes that you can go back and look at is the way in which mothers were honoured in the commandments that God gave. Now, in the 10 commandments, we come to the 4th commandment, and here's a law that you will not find in any code of the ancient world. Honour thy father and thy mother. All the other ancient codes were absolutely insistent that fathers had to be obeyed. And you know, you can go right through the code of Hammurabi, and even in Egypt, fathers had supreme right in the family. But when you come to God's law, he says you honour your father and thy mother. And this is something which is quite unique to the law of Moses. And it's repeated a number of times. So God put the father and mother both to be honoured by their families. But when you go to Leviticus 19 and verse 3, Again, another very unique chapter where we have God manifestation coming across, because every command in Leviticus 19 is actually signed off with I am Yahweh your God. So this is a matter of reflecting God in the way we behave. God says this in verse 3, shall fear every man his mother and his father. And as I said, you search all the ancient codes for a mention of a mother at all, and if you ever found one, it would never be the mother first. And yet God says in Leviticus 19, you've got to fear your mother and your father. And this is putting it in the order in which the most influence is actually upon the child, because the early and the main shaping influence on a child is the mother. And that's why it's important that mothers are always respected. That's why why fathers must ensure that children respect their mother and never are allowed to cheek their mother or strike their mother. They must respect their mother, and that's very clearly stated in Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 3. And when you go to the Proverbs, and there's a whole number of Proverbs that actually say, listen to your father and your mother, and the way that they teach you the things of God. And respect is the thing a child must learn, that you can never have a situation where the mother is disrespected. I happened to be sitting on a plane going to America a few years ago, where there was an Islamic family in front of me, in the row of seats in front of me, and quite literally the 10 or 12, 11-year-old child, the boy that was there, the way he treated his mother and his sisters was abominable, to the point that the captain of the plane came down and warned the father that if he couldn't control this boy, they'd put him in handcuffs. But the way he treated his mother and his sisters was absolutely terrible. And you know, he'd learned from his culture that women are somehow second class. And that's not what the law of Moses ever encouraged. So we have a situation where the mother is honoured by the things of God. And furthermore, later on in the law of Moses, you find that people who did not respect their parents were in grave danger. And assaulting either parent carried a death penalty. Very clearly in Exodus 21 that we read, verse 15 and 17, he that smiteth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death, and cursing the parents likewise. And it just gives you some idea of the way that God viewed the relationship within the family, that parents had to be respected and they must never be cursed or attacked by their children. And later in Deuteronomy, you find that's carried further through, where a child is continually disobedient, where a child is unwilling, an older child particularly is unwilling to accept the guidance of parents, then they could eventually be stoned. And that's something which, of course, the modern world finds abhorrent. But again, you get some idea that God demanded respect within families to be upheld. So very clearly, the law of God was there, and the mother gets a very important part of respect within that. I now want to come to this section in Exodus 21, and it is a little tricky, and I do have a small handout I will send on to Brother Nathan for distribution for those who would like a copy, just so that you can actually go through and do a bit more work on this yourself. But this is one of the great areas that the feminists object to in the Bible. They say this is the selling of daughters to pay debts. And again, it's a classic case of putting the worst construction on a situation that God had provided for. And if they call it the bride price or the selling of daughters. So what are we dealing with here? Well, picking it up in verse 7 of Exodus chapter 21, I'd like you to follow through this with me. This would seem out of place today, and I clearly accept that, because our modern world would never have a situation where, in the Western world, where parents actually dictate who their children marry, and certainly they would never be married as a matter of a financial situation. Different, of course, in other countries where arranged marriages are still the norm and where dowries are still the norm. We need to understand that the world in which these laws were given, that arranged marriages and dowries were a common thing that happened. And in many countries, and particularly in Africa and in some Pacific islands, and in some parts of Asia and the Middle East, that dowry and arranged marriages are still the order of the day. So we have to be aware that we're talking in our Western world in a different culture. So God said there would be a situation that could come up where a man was in some desperate financial circumstances, and his daughter would go into service with a view of marriage. So here's a case where the father's got probably an expanding family. He has an older daughter. There's somebody else in his village or town that needs a wife. And so this girl goes in as a servant into that house until such time as she is married to either the owner of the house or to his son. And we need to understand that when there was, as Jesus said, the poor you have always, and the poor laws in the Old Testament tell us that there would always be people who would get into financial strife. So the father could not provide for his family, and this daughter would go into service with a view to marriage into a much better financial situation. And a dowry payment was made to her father, which would probably be the relief of his debt, or something for him to re-establish his farm, or whatever the economic circumstance was. So this was an arranged marriage to the employer or his son, and we find that in verse 8 and 9, where it talks about what happens if that doesn't happen. But arranged marriages were the custom of the times, and as I said, in many cultures they still are today. And those who've had teenage children go through those very difficult years. A lot of us that sometimes thought arranged marriages might be a great idea, but the children didn't agree with us. But arranged marriages, quite surprisingly, have been analysed by the people in society who do these sort of researches, and they actually have historically a very high success rate. And that's because in those cultures, people that go into them with a determination to make it work, and in many cases the parent selection has been quite wise. So arranged marriages were the custom of those times and still are in many cultures. So here was a situation where she went into service with a view that she would one day be married into that family. There's an overriding law in verse 9 which covers every situation that can follow thereafter. Now, this girl is in a very vulnerable situation. She's going into a house where maybe she doesn't know these people very well. She's probably going to have other women in that house she has to contend with. So she's quite vulnerable. But it says in verse 9, whatever happens, she must always be treated as a daughter of the house. So even though she would go there and she would perform some domestic duties, she was not to be treated as a slave in any way. She always had to be treated as a daughter of the house. And that is a very clear overriding principle, the way that she was to be treated in this house. And of course, this clearly means that she was never to become a sex slave, which is what the feminists accuse God of instituting in this law. So what happens now if she's there? You notice in verse 7, she goes and she starts as the role of a maidservant, but she shall not go out as the men servants do. So they can't send her out into the field and say, go and do a man's work. So again, everything God says about it, she's got to be treated properly as a daughter of the house or as a maidservant. And we're going to see later on that maidservants were especially well looked after by God. So she's there and she's covered by the laws of maidservants. If the master or his son suddenly decide that this is not a good choice, I'm not going to marry this girl, and they go and marry somebody else, then there's a number of options. So she could be redeemed by her family. They might have now got their act together. They could perhaps borrow money from somewhere else, and they could come and they could buy her back. So they could pay off whatever they'd got for her going into the situation, and they could redeem her and take her home. So that was one option. If that couldn't happen, she must never be sold to somebody else, and particularly not to Gentiles. So they couldn't say, oh, look, we don't want to marry this girl. I'm going to sell her off to some Ammonite or Moabite as a concubine. You can't do that. She could never, and you could never sell a Hebrew, could never sell another Hebrew. So she couldn't be sold to foreigners. If she stayed on in the house, so a family haven't got the money to redeem her, so she's got to stay there. She comes under the law of maidservants, and as I said, my next section will deal with maidservants and how well they were treated. But she would stay in that house as a maidservant, and she had to be looked after and provided food, clothing, and shelter. If she was not provided for, if they didn't give her the things she needed, then she could just walk out. She could go back home without any cost or repayment of the debt, or she could go and she could work for somebody else. But, you know, it was completely because she had been let down by this promise of marriage. And when it says there in verse 8, he hath dealt deceitfully with her, the ESV has, he has broken faith with her. So a breach of promise has actually happened. And you know, the promise of marriage that she went there to get involved and to get married to the master or his son, that promise has been broken. They have deceived her. They've broken their faith, and therefore they now have a responsibility to make sure that she is well looked after and doesn't become vulnerable to any other afflictions. So, same in verse 9, if he betroth her to his son, he shall do with her after the manner of daughters. So she now becomes a daughter in that house, both before and after the marriage, obviously. And even if she's not married to the son, she's still going to be treated as a daughter of the house. And that just gives you some idea of how much God was protecting this girl, who has been put into a very vulnerable and very uncomfortable situation by the breach of faith of her employer. Now, I want to make some comment about the way the feminists, of course, would look at this is that this girl has been sold as a concubine, and they completely misread verse 10 about the duty of marriage as being the fact that she then just becomes she's treated as a concubine. And 2 points you can make with that. God always totally forbade sexual exploitation, and you can see that in Leviticus 19, verse 29. And God never approved of concubinage. And of course, we know what happened with the kings. Something God said they shouldn't do, but they nevertheless did. But God never approved of concubinage as a custom, even though it was very common in many other nations. So in the Old Testament and New Testament, God never actually approved of taking of concubines, and he's certainly not doing it here. So what does the duty of marriage in verse 10 actually mean? We need to do a little bit of work on this, because this is something which is grossly misrepresented by the feminist movement. Now, when we come to verse 10, it's often assumed that because in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 5, let's just go to the 1 Corinthians 7, verse 5, because here we have Paul discussing marriage situations and answering a number of questions about marriage which were sent to him by the Corinthian ecclesia. And we notice in chapter 7, verse 5, where Paul is talking to husbands and wives about their responsibilities to each other in a physical relationship. And so he says in verse 5, defraud not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency or lack of self-control. So Paul actually states in Corinthians that partners who go into a marriage relationship do have a sense of duty and responsibility to each other to provide for their physical needs. And because we have this similar concept of providing for physical needs in Corinthians, people assume that immediately back in Exodus 21, that when it says he shall give her duty of marriage, that this is the fact that he's got to have sexual relations with her as a concubine, even though he won't marry her. Well, that, of course, is not what God intended. So back in Exodus 21, verse 10, let's just examine this incredibly unique word, which is translated as duty. And it is a unique word. Because we can't compare with other translations, or we can't compare with how it's translated in other places, we have to go back and look at the root of the word. And the root word indicates a dwelling or shelter. Some of the Hebrew scholars say it has relationship to oil or ointments. And so you're getting an idea, it's the needs of life. Young's Literal has translated that as her food, her covering, and her habitation. So food, clothes, and shelter. ESV has her marital rights, which I think is probably quite a good translation, but still leaves the door open to the assumption of sexual abuse. And this is a case where this girl has got to be treated as a daughter of the house, and she's got to be provided for all the needs of life that she has, and in return she continues to serve as a maidservant. And that's, I think, what God is doing. So let's always remember that this law was designed by a loving God to prevent abuse to somebody in a vulnerable position. And the girl who's no longer got a promise of marriage is in a vulnerable position. But they cannot mistreat her. They cannot use her in a wrong way. So I'll come to the law of maidservants at the end of this particular session, and you'll see how well maidservants were actually treated under the law of God. And it's a remarkable thing that God provided for these most vulnerable of women in these situations. So in Exodus 21, let's just summarize by saying that it was never a provision for girls to be sold into sexual slavery. Yes, there was a situation of family debt that was actually covered by her going into service. But in her case, she was going, in most cases, she would go straight into a marriage in a much better financial position than staying at home in a poor family. And in a time of the acceptance of arranged marriages, they would not think that was a great burden. So it's a case where God provided for her, and particularly this particular provision here is about what happens when she has been let down by the promises that were made to her, and to make sure she was therefore provided for in that unfortunate situation. So again, it's a matter of how you want to read the law. If you want to come here and try and find that a girl's been sold by her father and becomes a sex slave, then you can read it that way, as the feminists do. We come at it from the point of view that this is a loving God preparing for the needy and the vulnerable. And God is making sure that there is no abuse, even in a situation where a family's got into debt. And I think, because the bulk of this is about providing for her when the breach of faith occurs, we can see that God's emphasis is on protection. So again, we read that law quite different to the feminists. I want to go now to another one that the feminists have a problem with, that is the taking of female captives. Now, we pointed out in our previous class about the genocide of the Canaanites that Israel were commanded to kill every Canaanite, man, woman, and child, because the nation was incredibly apostate, incredibly affected by the immoral religion of Canaan. Israel were never, ever told to go and attack nations outside the promised land of Canaan. The only time they ever went to war against those nations is where those nations had proved to be hostile and had attacked Israel, and therefore they could go out and they could take on those nations on their home territory when they had been attacked by these nations. And so you find in David's day that there's war with the Ammonites. But generally, Israel never went to war outside Canaan unless they had been attacked by those nations. So in the situations where they did go and attack, say, a city of the Ammonites, when the Israelites had actually conquered the city and taken the city, they would kill all the males in the city, all the married women, but they could take from that city female captives who were virgins. Now, they could never take Canaanites to be wives, but they could take women from far off lands away from the land of Canaan. They could take those women to be wives and bring them home with a view to marriage. So only the virgins. But when they got home, there was a very special law. So come to Deuteronomy 21. And I want to just again show you how differently we can read the record. If you're coming at it from a feminist standpoint, then any woman taken in war to them would be a great sin. But what was the alternative for these women? Well, we know what happens in nearly every war that's ever happened where there has been a conquest by invasion, is that the first thing that happens when cities are conquered is widespread rape and abuse of women. And you've only got to read the history of what happened when the Russians came into Berlin and when the Germans went into Russia. You get the factual history of what happened. And of course, rape and abuse of women was an incredibly common thing. And not only for those nations, but almost every other nation down through history, where you go back to the days of the Vikings and the Mongols, it was all about capturing women for the lusts of men. And in the Bible, of course, we have the case of Sisera, and his mother commenting that he'd soon be home with a whole bunch of concubines. Well, that was what war normally achieved in ancient times. And even in modern times, we still see rape being used as a genocide weapon. So it's a consequence of wars that God said that's not to happen. They were not to go and to do this when they conquered these cities. Yes, they would put to death all of those who had attacked Israel, but they could take virgins from those cities and bring them home. So let's read in Deuteronomy 21, verse 10 to 14. When you go forth against thine enemies, and Yahweh thy God delivers them into your hands and taken them captive, and you see amongst the captives a beautiful woman, have a desire to her, you shall have her to thy wife, and bring her home to her house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and put off her raiment and put on sackcloth. And so, you know, you bring home this beautiful girl. You can't take her on the spot. You bring her home to your house, and the first thing she does is she shaves off her hair. Now, we all know that a woman's hair is her natural glory. When people wanted to disgrace women, like after the recapture of France in World War II, all the women who had collaborated with Germans were paraded through the streets with their heads shaved. It was a way of completely humiliating a woman, is to have her head shaved off. So here's a woman who gets rid of her natural beauty. She takes her nails, cuts her nails right down. She puts on sackcloth and she sits there mourning her parents. So she's given a whole month to mourn her parents. And then, of course, she can go to be married to the man who had captured her. But when you think what that did is that when people are in the battlefield and they've just won a victory, there's often a tremendous adrenaline rush. There's this tremendous sense of victory, and this is when abuses tend to happen. This man takes her home, and for a whole month, he's got time to get to know her, to find out what sort of person she really is outside the surface level, and to decide whether he's making actually a good decision. So, you know, this was a better fate for the woman. I mean, what was going to happen if her city's been completely broken down by the Israeli army? What's she going to do? She's probably going to die in the battle. She's going to be left to starve, or then left for other people to come along and to make a concubine of her, or a slave of her, which is what happened in ancient times after cities were defeated. So here's another case of God regulating human behavior that he didn't really want it to occur. God never said, I want you to go out and capture women. He says, oh, I know you'll do this. I know you'll take virgins and bring them home. And I know you do it based on her looks alone, because you've had no time to talk to her. You've just found a pretty woman. This is mine. I'll bring her home like a trophy. Well, she diminishes her attractiveness. You've got to wait a month while she's walking around in mourning clothes and her hair's just starting to grow. And you can imagine how different this man would look at this woman after a month, particularly if he finds out that this woman is lacking in character or wisdom. And he would probably decide, look, hey, this was a bit of a hasty decision. I don't really want to go ahead with this. And then in verse 14, it shall be, if you have no delight in her, you'll let her go whether she will, but you can't sell her for money. You can't make merchandise of her because you've humbled her. And they were never allowed to sell this woman as a slave to get a profit out of her. She was released into the community. She became one of the strangers in Israel who were provided for by the tithes and offerings. She would probably end up going to work as a maidservant for somebody else. She may even be married to another Israelite eventually. But, you know, they could never treat her as merchandise. And that, again, just shows you a vulnerable woman brought home with the view that she would be married, again, not going to get married, and therefore she goes and she's allowed to walk free. And again, you can just see how God provided for the vulnerable woman in this situation. So, you know, there was no way that God wanted women to be left vulnerable and mistreated. And probably it's never more clear in the law of Moses than we come to the issue of maidservants. And I want to just go back to Exodus 21, where we have one of the first laws about maidservants. Because, you know, the maidservant was perhaps the lowest person on the social rung, other than perhaps the foreign worker who'd been brought into Israel. But a maidservant was probably a girl in her teens. She was a girl that had probably been gone into service because her family were poor. You might think that's strange. My own mother was in service at the age of 12 because she was one of the older girls in a family of 10 in a very poor circumstance. She had to leave school and go and work as a maid at the age of 12. So that's not many generations ago. Of course, most 12-year-old girls today would be horrified at the thought of that. But that's how much we are in a very materialistic society today. In Exodus 21, and we read this in verse 26, if a man smite the eye of his servant, and I want you to notice this in its comment, or the eye of his maid. You know, the charge against God, that God is misogynist and favours men, whenever God made a law for protection, the women folk were always included. So if a man lashes out in anger and he permanently damages a servant, then they go free for the eye's sake. So the eye is used as an example, but if he causes a permanent disability by striking his servant, then they just walk out free. If you smite out a tooth even, then they can walk out for a tooth. So you weren't allowed to physically harm your servants. You think of the difference where in many countries slaves are actually controlled with whips and dogs and things like that. You know, God's law was clear. You do not strike your servant. And you can't even just risk just a blow because you might knock out a tooth and they can walk out free. And any debt that they were paying off is immediately cancelled. So, you know, there was protection from physical harm, and it included the maidservants. In Exodus 20, verse 17, you know, you shall not covet your neighbour's house, you shall not covet his wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant. So again, you couldn't covet maidservants. And you know, they were not to become an extra concubine in the house because they were a maidservant. And I don't know how familiar you are with Victorian society and the, you know, the system of lords and earls and that in England, but, you know, maidservants were routinely treated as extra concubines to the fathers and sons of those houses. And it's just a tragedy that happened in what was cultured society. But, you know, God says maidservants were not to be lusted after. They were not there for sexual objects. And they had to be treated with great respect. They had to be included in the family worship. Just come to Deuteronomy chapter 12. It's quite remarkable. Whenever they went to Jerusalem or whether they went to any service of worship, Deuteronomy 12, verse 12, you shall rejoice before Yahweh your God, your sons, your daughters, and your menservants, and your maidservants. So whenever they went to worship somewhere, or whenever there was a Sabbath day being kept, whenever there was going up to the Feast of Jerusalem, the maidservants went along as well. And I think that's one of the most wonderful provisions you could ever imagine, that God would actually provide for those maidservants to be treated as a spiritual equal when it came to family worship. And you know, they were specially looked after in that way. They were required to keep the Sabbath. So it wasn't a matter of saying to the maidservant, look, we've got to keep the Sabbath, you keep working. No, she had the same spiritual experience as all the members of the household. And when it came to the laws of release in Deuteronomy 15, just come to Deuteronomy 15 and verse 12, it says, if thy brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee. And of course, you've got to remember, as we said before, selling there was not a matter of like a slave trade. It was that there was a financial transaction behind this. There was a debt that was paid off, or a debt that was worked off. So for a transaction's been made, and at the 7th year, they go out free. And they were given all the goodies when they left the house, the same as a manservant. The females also got well provided for when they left. So again, you see that there was this tremendous provision for the release of women and leaving in the 7th year as well. So, you know, what a wonderful thing that God provided such care for these maidservants who were treated so well, who were given spiritual equality when it came to worship, and could never be mistreated or lusted after. And it's so tragic in today's world when you read about the way that some of the Asian girls that go to work in Middle East countries, how they're treated in those households as nothing more than sex slaves. It's a terrible thing that happens to them. And you know, that's in our modern, so much enlightened world that they call it. But under God's law, there was tremendous care for the vulnerable and for those who needed protection. And so God provided those things in his law. And what we have to remember is it's how if you come at the law determined to pick fault, and you come with existing feminist values, you will find fault with the law. If you come and to say God the Creator is a loving, caring God who cares for the vulnerable and the weak and the fatherless and the poor and the widows and for the maidservants, if you come at it with that approach, that this is an expression of God's character, then you can read these laws in such a way that we understand that God was providing for the vulnerable. And that's why in Exodus 21, it wasn't about the rights of the men to these women. It was about what happened if the men didn't keep their promises, and to make sure the women were therefore didn't suffer as a result. And it's the same with this girl who would stay in the house as a maidservant, even though the marriage promise had disappeared. She would be treated as a daughter of the house and under all the laws of maidservants that we see here. And so God was protecting the vulnerable. And that's just such a different approach to how the feminists would read these Old Testament laws. So we can be very confident we're dealing with a God that knows what he's doing. The law is holy, the commandment is holy, it's just and it's good. It's perfect, converting the soul. It's sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of Yahweh are right, rejoicing the heart, and the command of Yahweh is pure, enlightening the eyes. And so we have great confidence in our God that he looks after those in Israel who lived in a different cultural age to ourselves, but who were vulnerable and needed his protection. Thank you.